I once went to China, and in fact, it is very interesting that when their provincial governor were really speaking, all the people were doodling on their mobile phones. So what happened? This provincial governor really got annoyed. The next meeting, all the mobile phones were really confiscated from all the audience. Okay, so and in China it's very strange because when the camera, they have drone camera, all kind of camera, when they zoom in to the audience, everybody was like this. I don't know whether it has simplified our life or had made it more complex. Okay, how many likes, how many all those things. But in fact, what has really missed out of all these technology savvy people is that whether we are technologically updated or we have humanely outdated, which means we don't want to talk to each other even when we are in metro or something like that. But in international affairs, this doesn't happen. Thank God in international affairs, nations don't use mobile phones. And they better talk to each other, and that's why things like shuttle diplomacy, things like summit diplomacy, things like multilateral diplomacy have taken shape. Okay, before embarking on the journey with me, let me introduce myself. I am Pankaj K. Jha. I use Pankaj Jha as a better straight name. I was with the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis for near about 7 years, which is the premier defense and strategic think tank in India. Then I moved on to National Security Council, which is the Prime Minister's office, worked with the really complex environment in which you are not even allowed to take your cell phones inside. So you see how tough and difficult a life for 2 long years. Then I moved to Indian Council of World Affairs, which deals with foreign affairs, and it's a government think tank managed by the Ministry of External Affairs. I was director of research over there. And then after near about 12 years of work and being the jack of multiple trades, I thought I should become a master, and here I am. I'm teaching students about what exactly is the rigorous exercise of strategic and policy planning is all about. So welcome all of you to India. India is complex, complicated, but when you apply yourself, it's easier to understand. And as your former High Commissioner and now Foreign Secretary Peter Verghese said, in India, patience pays. And that's what he had to really do when there were certain unfortunate incidents in Australia with regard to Indian students. And he was lecturing each month near about 10 places about how Australia is, what Australia is all about. When we talk about India, the first thing really comes about, and you might have come across a number of articles which say reluctant power, hesitant power, a major power which has yet to become a superpower. These type of metaphors have really hogged the limelight. But let me tell you, India doesn't work as per the so-called metaphors or phrases used. India works on a completely different plane. It works on understanding the nuances. Why? Because India works both with Iran and Saudi Arabia. India works both with China and both with the US. And that's how it manages. You know, with India, the biggest, the thing really comes up that India is slow. But when a country or a vehicle is slow, you can easily take turns. When you are fast, it's hard to take turns. That is how India has really developed and how its policy, both in terms of strategic framework and foreign policy, has evolved over a period of years. What we inherited? We inherited something which was something that we have to develop. We have to develop and take masses, millions of them together so that they can come out of poverty, underdevelopment, and provide employment. Further still, let me tell you, India also draws heavily from its scriptures, text, and it says the world is a global village. So you don't fight with relatives. What you become a comprehensive, all-encompassing lot which want to give hug to each other and greet each other with yes, say, namaste. That is it. So how India has evolved and what exactly is its policy and strategy with regard to Asia Pacific. Before embarking on this, let me pose a few questions which you might also come across as a student. does India really have a national security strategy? To which the answer is no. We don't have. Because once we define our national security strategy, it will come under scrutiny with regard to what will be the possibilities, what are the planning, what is the capability building, and how we are going to achieve those objectives. So we are keeping it as vague as possible. The second aspect is that, does India have the necessary blueprint for national security strategy? The answer to this is, the basic elements of national security strategy you can find in the government text, which come out in the form of maritime strategy documents. The three documents which were released in 2004, 2009, and subsequently in 2016. And also, there is also comprehensive, joint warfare strategy, which again came out in 2016. The thing is that if you want to understand India, you need to micro-analyze things, see it in perspective without looking into the elite declarations or statements which are coming out. Furthermore, within a period of time, foreign policy has been strongly influenced by the characters and the leaders who want to profess it. The policy for the last 60 odd years, Nehru was an idealist. But then people criticized Nehru that he could not do much in projecting India as a superpower. But given the resources that you have, I believe Nehru had the best policy ever. He became a leader, India got recognition. Subsequently, when Indira Gandhi was there, she really took initiative and liberated Bangladesh. Why? Because there were a whole lot of refugees infiltrating into Bangladesh. At that point of time, that might be the only possible solution. Then the peaceful nuclear test of 1974. Yes, there were political compulsions, but then that was the only way left out to show that India has arrived at the global stage. Subsequently, if you see, the Manmohan Singh government, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, the Manmohan Singh government, and subsequently now Modi's government, the priorities are different because now India has two major sources. First, we have a youth population which is huge. Second, we now have the financial capabilities and resources to support all the endeavors which we have undertaken way back in 1990s. The biggest tectonic shift which happened in 1990s was India's establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. And now Israel is one of the foremost strategic partners that we have, with which we haven't yet signed the strategic partnership agreement. Russia's demise opened new vistas for us to engage countries from China to Australia. Why? Because multi-alignment subsequently became the norm for the day for India to survive. The third question is, what is the best option for India? Is it policy hopping or policy continuity? If you look into India's policy, it has always been into the incremental phase. And it has always served the continuity, so that the continuum serves our basic strategic interest and calibrate our larger goals in the whole schema of things. The fourth issue is whether the time is right to integrate external objectives both in foreign policy and strategic domain. Incidentally, in India, the strategic issue has been used very often nowadays. Earlier, it was not very much professed because it was seen strategically, technically means alliances and alignments, to which India was averse to. What is the role of strategic partnership? This is one question which you might really face across. What is India's strategic partnership? This whole term of strategic partnership gives India a flexibility to adopt. We might have strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia for energy, oil, and counterterrorism cooperation. We might have strategic partnership with Iran. In fact, Iran was one of the foremost strategic partners for India. And the first strategic partner for India ever was South Africa, 1997. We have strategic partnership with France, with UK, Russia, you name it. In total, 32 strategic partnerships exist with India and many other countries. Few of the strategic partnerships had been elevated to the level of comprehensive strategic partnerships. What does comprehensive really means? It encapsulates economic, political, defense, strategic, cultural, and whole issues which can be really addressed as and when the time demands. And this is how India is progressing. Then the question comes, what are the structural constraints for future? Will India grow the way it is to the level of 7 to 8%? We might be touching 9% in future, God knows. But what are the structural constraints? The structural constraint will come up when there will be a big debate whether we want to align with US or we remain multi-aligned with both US, China, Russia, or whether we want to emerge as another power center in which many of the other countries will be gravitating towards. Are we able to create a power center which is somewhere between US and China? And how Asia Pacific figures in India's strategic calculus. In fact, most strategic partnership, if you enlist them, the maximum are with Asia Pacific countries, ranging from Australia to Japan. China is also a strategic partner. And this shows the whole range, the horizon of India's policy, both in foreign policy terms and strategic endeavors. However, let me put a caveat that strategic partnership has different contents and preferences with regard to it. So, when we talk about national security strategy and Asia Pacific, since I worked with that establishment, I can say that now India has transcended the immediate neighborhood confines, which means we are not a South Asian power. Thank you very much. We have outgrown Pakistan and we are negotiating with China. Earlier, anything and everything about South Asia was what India was confined into, but no, we are not. The second aspect is packaging approach. India, which was earlier getting a lot of foreign aid from countries in Europe, US and Canada, is now saying, no, thank you very much. That aid we also can give in terms of developmental aid. So in the ministry, we have a whole institution which came up as the development and planning assistance. And this shows how India became from an aid taker to an aid giver country. At times, it has become more in the kind approach, which means computers, health services, health medicines, all these kinds of things. And at times, it's an aid and assistance for developing infrastructure projects, which could be of some use for the local population. The stress now for India, particularly in the Asia Pacific, is developing educational knowledge and services network, in which every nation which participates, partners with India, gets to develop its own acumen and skill set. And thus you see it right from the Pacific Islands to Laos and Cambodia and many other Asian nations. In our foreign policy approach, the range which you call as Middle East is known as West Asia. So technically we also take in West Asia as part of our larger Asia Pacific policy. India is now looking for greater avenues for integration, and this clearly shows when we are really tailoring certain aspects of it, like Africa, India-Africa Foreign Summit. We have a separate set of institutional mechanism which addresses their development, employment and other aspects of it. The second is Forum for Pacific Islands in FIPIC, Forum for Cooperation between Pacific Islands and India, for which 3 summits have been really held. Then we are also multi-layered planning in which we are doing an incremental process. We ask the nations which are underdeveloped to what exactly they need, and that way we tailor our resources and package policy accordingly. For many of these countries, the main thing that India can really contribute is in terms of education, skill training, and even developing local solutions. In fact, one of the solutions which was used across Africa and even in Pacific Islands was known as barefoot grandmothers. What exactly is it? Most of these island nations, including in Pacific, the men usually go to Australia and New Zealand. You might be very well aware of people searching for employment opportunities in Australia and New Zealand. So they are left mostly with women. And women, those who are old, cannot be employed. So we train them to at least fix solar panels on their rooftops and have electricity all the year round. This is how we really nurture talent and train them, midwifery. Most of the problems in many of these island nations is that medical solutions are not available. So you train these wives, the grandmothers and healthy mothers, to do the midwifery so that the pregnancy can be carried out without any hitch or the requirement of doctors. So that's how it helps, nudges, education. Even if there is a primary school and we contribute certain computers to them or medicines to them, that helps a lot in developing the society and making them more secure and giving them certain space with regard to development. What also has happened all throughout is that integrating economic and foreign policy objectives that India has embarked into. In Australia and New Zealand, you have Department for Foreign Policy and Trade. In India, there are two different ministries dealing with two different sets of trade and foreign policy. There was a debate within India that it should be integrated so that we can reach out to the Asia Pacific nations in a big way, because then you can synchronize your foreign policy and trade policy. But India is a huge country, 1.25 billion people. So if we integrate each other, the problem is that many of the people and the officials, we have lesser posts to really get promoted into. So we diversify. We might make it much more comprehensive so that we can know, we can collate information, we can get information and develop our strategies and policy accordingly. The other aspect is that India now is carefully articulating national security interest. Is a war with China or a tension with China suitable for our future development plans? Is alignment with US serve our interest now or will not? Is a very harsh treatment between India and Russia serves our interest both in the short term or the long term? So that's how we are looking into our national security interest in the larger framework of things. But it faces drawbacks. Drawbacks which are very much similar to all the Asian countries. Policy inertia. And in most of the countries, bureaucrats don't think. It's the scholars, the planners, the policy, and students who said, let's do something like this. There might be an idea which might be germinating from many of your students like you. What Australia did with regard to country profile, when it initiated country profile of the 5 Asian nations, it went round the corner of the country to get responses from more than 25,000 respondents. So what it came out with, a 25-page document which enlisted that if we want to engage with Indonesia, these are the framework and these are the conditions that we work into. With India, they have a similar kind of structure and planning process. That's how India is also developing into. India has 3 levels of dialogue. When you want to really scrutinize what exactly is India's policy going to be, look into where they are doing track 2 dialogues. Track 2 dialogues technically mean think tanks involved in interacting with other institutions and other contemporary academic profiling institutions. And there is in India, the problem is being huge, being mammoth, there is an overcautious approach. Overcautious approach because if you give a birth to a child, a thought, a process or idea, whether it will survive the rigmarole of the power dynamics or not. And this we have seen in the case of 2 basic frameworks. One was BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal Community on Technology and Economic Cooperation, and the second was Mekong-Ganga Economic Cooperation. Both of these could not survive for long because we didn't have funds to really support them. Now what we are doing? We are reviving those institutions. BRICS BIMSTEC Summit, what was it in 2015? Was to revive that BIMSTEC, which was a composite organization comprising of least developed countries in this region, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, you name it. And that's how we want to really approach this thing. Then there is the issue of cost overruns and lack of application that India has been facing into. You give a birth to a grand idea, but if you can't financially support it, then it creates a heartburn among many of the countries which want to get more, both in terms of funding, support, and also integration with India. So when we talk about Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, that is the biggest challenge that India is facing. Should we get into the Asia Pacific, in which we integrate ourselves into the larger Asia and then talk with Pacific, or we want a very Indo-Pacific, which means India integrating much more largely into Asia Pacific, but it's a more India-centric approach. So whether you want to be focused or you want to be a member of a larger game plan. Then there are changing dynamics in the region. You have Japan, which is trying to get out of its pacifist constitution. You have North Korea, which is just always showing the nuclear trigger and show I can press the button. And then you have Trump saying, I have a bigger button. So the problem is everybody is talking about button, but whether it's integrated with the nuclear button or not, it's everybody's guess. Then there is evolving power struggle between China, Russia, US, and many other regional powers. US and China, they might be at loggerheads on certain issues, be it the South China Sea issue, but on certain issues, they are hand in gloves. So the problem with India is whether it wants to flag its preferences with regard to US or China, and then came to know that both are very good allies, buddies, and who has an embarrassing situation will be India. So, and also further, there are new fissiparous and secessionist tendencies across Asia. And this is how we really look into how we are going to see into. We still have problems with regard to Indonesia. We have few of the provinces won independence, and Philippines, which is also trying to really eke out a new province. Then there are open-ended multilateral institutions. East Asia Summit. It was merely the ASEAN plus 6. But in 2011, 2 more countries came on board, Russia and US. Then there is community building. This community word is very much fashionable in foreign policy discourse. ASEAN community, East Asian community, Indo-Pacific community. So, and free trade areas. Everybody wants to develop a free trade area, and you have a whole lot of free trade areas which are still into different phases of emancipation, development, and negotiations. Non-traditional security threats. How many of you have gone through many of the multilateral institutions' declarations? If you type non-traditional security threats, that is the only thing that talks about multiple institutions that they talk about. Pandemics, diseases, maritime, tsunami, natural disasters. Why? Because it's the best option for many of the foreign policy mandarins to agree into. It's a common denominator in which many of the countries agree into it. Then there is a bigger paradox between security and economic. And this paradox, I believe Australia is also facing and India is also facing. Whether you want security through alliances system, strategic partnership, or you want economic development without annoying anybody. And that's what is the debate at the international level between security and economics. So when we talk about Asia Pacific, this geopolitical architecture in the current century, the few changes are visible. What are the changes? Japan is changing. Vietnam is coming up. Indonesia is revving up. However, Indonesia has its own problem with regard to Islamic radicalism. The issue is no country is seeking to transform US politics or assert hegemony over countries of vital interest to the United States. But there are certain preferences which are changing. You see in the case of Philippines. You see in the case of many other countries which are in the periphery of China. Look, China is the biggest money lender. We will go to the cheapest money lender who gives us easy loans. And China, which has got one belt and one road, and one man who is really showing the show, Xi Jinping, it's his dream, his idea, his concept. Let's see how it really fructifies. And that's what India's reservations are. Where is the money? And how long the money will take? And what will the prospects with regard to employment? Will any country like that if there is a China's one belt, one road, and there is a whole lot of infrastructure and everything being developed, but the guys, local guys are losing employment, will any country sustain that? No. And that is what has been happening with regard to China's aid and assistance program all across Asia. There is resistance in Burma, there is resistance in countries in Africa, because it's not composite development. You will find Chinatowns in Laos, Cambodia, in Africa also. They have developed Chinatowns in which Chinese currency really functions. So there is a mini nation which is being developing. There is a new narrative which is being developed by the China. But what is China's urgency? In China, the biggest problem is the real wages are getting low, technically. Its inflation is high. When I went to China very recently, I asked one of the guys, Chinese guys, what is your bigger problem? He said, if we get a son, we have a huge tension. I said, come on. In the whole of Asia, sun is a prized possession. He said, no, when I get a son, the problem is I will have to buy an apartment and a nice car to get him married to a Chinese woman. And that is how society is all about. And then he said the other big problem is how to take care of the older generation of people, because your interest rates are very low to sustain them in the longer run. These are social issues which are being faced by the China. So, and when we talk about US security aspects, there are increasingly problems for the US security from terrorism, lone wolf attack, which we have seen, and proliferation of WMD, but not traditional security threats as such. China is joining the system. The whole overall composure of the China is joining the system. It's not subverting it, but calibrating countries' preferences. China or US, which is more preferred. Now, increasingly it is being talked that Asia's security architecture will be determined by United States, China and Japan, with India pitching in, because it will be known as a swing state. And furthermore, if India joins US, China, Japan and the so-called Quad, the whole power balance will be disturbed, because China will say they are ganging up. So Russia again is a Eurasian power, not a Pacific or a South Asian power. Sino-Japanese rivalries are reviving. South Korea has its own problem between an alliance with the United States and a rising concern about the North Korea. China is the principal sponsor of development through multilateral economic liberalization in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia is no longer dependent on US largesse. Interest alignments are increasingly getting blurred. So US-Japan-India military ideological alliance continues to strengthen. However, Japan tries to build an independent military, which means it is trying to come to terms that the whole power dynamics in Asia is changing, and US might not be the best security guarantor in the future. So Japan is preparing for future. Furthermore, when you look into the larger scheme of things, there are new terminology which is coming up, which is known as triads. What exactly is triads? Japan, India, Vietnam, new triad. Japan, India, Philippines, new triad. US, Australia, Japan, new triad, really coming up. It was in existence, but it's gaining much more salience. This triad system was borrowed very heavily from the economic triads which were existent, like Johor, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, economic growth triangle. Indonesia, Malaysia and Thailand, economic growth triangle. So this type of transgression from economic domains to security is what you are seeing into. Furthermore, an economically economically strong but militarily weak China is replacing Japan in the larger scheme of things. Vietnam and Indonesia are joining the Asian miracle system and eschewing further geopolitical expansion. At one point of time, there was a terminology similar like BRICS was shown, which was known as VISTA. Vietnam, Indonesia, Spain, Turkey and Argentina as the second rung of economic powers, middle powers, which are really going to come up. And furthermore, US priorities have shifted from economy and institution building to more exclusive military and democracy building all across. And this is how has given a leeway to China to make space for itself. So for India, what exactly is the playing field in larger Asia Pacific? Indonesia is a nascent democracy which is coming to terms with the whole process of democracy. And when you look across many of the Asia Pacific nations which have been independent in late 1940s and 50s, the problem was the military pillar. The military pillar, what it created a third pillar within an institution in which military became an important element of nation building. And this includes Myanmar, this includes Philippines, this includes Thailand, even though it was independent, and this includes Indonesia, where military had a say in the whole parliamentary system, scheme of things. Now the problem is, when military becomes politically more conscious, it's very difficult to let them, push them back to the barracks. And Malaysia has a two-party system. Myanmar is a semi-democracy. I don't know what will the future hold if in case Aung San Suu Kyi had a sudden demise. Does anybody know what is the second rung of leadership in the National League of Democracy? We hardly have seen anything. Any young political leader which has really hogged the limelight or international media attention? Hardly anybody. Even the president is heavily influenced by Aung San Suu Kyi. So, and Thailand, which has seen military rule every now and then, and you find a lot of flags, yellow and red, depending on your color preferences. If you are not locked into Thailand airport for 14 days, you are a really lucky guy. One of my senior persons who was in security establishment was there for 4 days, locked in Bangkok, and he says, that time I knew the importance of banana, because I was thriving on it for the last 3 days of my stay in Bangkok airport. So at times it gets a little bit claustrophobic in Thailand when you don't know whether the Bangkok elites will rule the national governance system or the rural areas which are still vying and subscribing to the Thaksin Shinawatra, who was the multi-billionaire politician, and his sister subsequently, Yingluck Shinawatra, hogged the post of Prime Minister. Brunei is a monarchy, but it is now hosting a lot of golf greens for Japanese. Every place you want to engage Japanese, open a golf club or a golf green, and they will come thronging out to you, and then you can have a good golf diplomacy with the Japanese. And that's how countries are really looking into it. Philippines is a democracy with certain characteristics. People don't know when there will be coup and when there will be a national emergency. And Philippines is the one country which doesn't have a sufficient military power to project it into. And that is the reason it doesn't really trust whether US will really come to save their 20 or 30 acres of island in the South China Sea. And that's why it switched sides. But Philippines, let me tell you, will come back again into the US fold. Till the time Duterte is there, he has his own convictions. Singapore is a single party with symbolic opposition, but Singapore's strategic depth is so less. It's barely 30 square kilometers of an island. And most of the flight, the pilots, when they come over to India, in fact, we host them for stationing few of their aircrafts in Kalaikunda, which is near West Bengal. And they said, Singapore, the time we put the rev up the engine, and within 5 minutes we are in Malaysia. We said, hello, can we enter your airspace? We don't have space even to fly. But in India, we go from north to south and east to west. We got a lot of land to really fly. We love it. We got the F-16, which is one of the premier fighter jets, and we don't have space to fly. So I had my sympathies with Singaporean. They are professional. And further still, when we, just an anecdotal part of it, many of the Singaporean cadets, young cadets, 17 to 18, come over and get training in few of the institutions. Our military is very professional. The bugle sounds at 5:30, and which means you have to get dressed up and be there on the ground at 5:30. And Singaporean guys, they're not used to this. And they said 5:30, and in the night, the 7 o'clock, the bugle sounds, and you have to be for the last attendance before you go to the bed. They say it's very harsh. But that's how Indian military really trains. Furthermore, there is another anecdote which I really want to share with all of you. One of these guys who was very young, colonel, I asked him what exactly is it, how the guys are finding it good or tough? How is it our training and when they come over? They said the bigger problem is the psychological dilemma. I said, what exactly is the psychological dilemma all about? They said a guy and his girlfriend both pass out of the college at the same point of time. The guy has to do conscription for 3 years, and the girl joins any other firm or institution. By the time the guy finishes her conscription and gets back to service, the girlfriend is his boss. So these kind of things really happen in Singapore. Vietnam and Laos have a communist party system, which clearly means they have a single party rule and decided by the communist fundamentals. Korea is a South Korea, I'm talking about a democracy. The North Korea is a dictatorship. Japan is revising pacifist constitution, has its own kind of democracy in which none of the prime ministers survive for more than 2 years. So I give hats off to Abe, who survived long enough to make Japan much more stable country in terms of political things. Australia again is a multi-party democracy, you know more than me. And New Zealand again is a multi-party democracy. So this is the canvas that India has to really look into. This is the canvas in which it has to frame its priorities accordingly. The problem is that in many of these countries, in many other countries, there is a shadow minister which also works in sync with the parallel objectives of the government. But in India, opposition cannot pursue foreign policy objectives. It's the prerogative of the government only. So at times, it gets very difficult to do a course correction in the middle. And that's how we have become much more realistic. When Myanmar, we went on with Aung San Suu Kyi, but for long, Aung San Suu Kyi could not gain the political mileage or the relevance, and that's how we have to get back to the military rulers to negotiate our interests and our objectives in Myanmar. When we look into the Asia Pacific, the one thing which really have come up is Look East policy. You might have heard a lot about it, but Look East policy have also a change in nomenclature. First, it was Look East policy from 1990s onwards. Then from 2000 onwards, it was Look East policy 2. And subsequently, let me tell you more, that between the earlier United Progressive Alliance government and the coming of the NDA, there was a new term which was used in the foreign policy documents, which was known as Enhanced Look East policy. And now, subsequently, there was talk with regard to Engage East policy, and they said, lot of Look East policy, the whole of the countries will look as we are really oogling at them. Let's now Act East policy. So that's a better word. Look East doesn't really serve any purposes. So what has really changed in terms of Act East policy? First, we have a defined action plan with regard to multiple countries in the region, ranging particularly from ASEAN, and then at the bilateral level with countries like Australia, Korea, and Japan, and also hobnobbing with China, because that is the major concern for us. It's not an enemy, but it's an adversary for which India is really concerned about. What exactly have been the achievements all through the 30 years of the Look East policy, more than 35 years of Look East policy? We have an ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement. Then we have India-Thailand Free Trade Agreement, India-Malaysia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and India-Singapore Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. Australia, we are negotiating, but then your dairy products are too good for us to survive them. So most of our dairy products would have been closed, particularly domestic manufacturing, and also your wool and other related products. India-Indonesia FTA, we are negotiating, but technically negotiations are still to start, and we are looking for new horizons with regard to economic cooperation between India and Japan, Korea, and Australia. In fact, ASEAN-India Services Agreement is yet to be enforced, as Philippines is holding back because of certain reservations, because in services sector, Philippines and India are the biggest competitors, particularly with regard to business process outsourcing. So if we are losing jobs to US, it's because of Philippines, because they are equally good English-speaking people. And we are also one more element which has really come up in our Act East policy is defense cooperation. And we have a whole range of defense cooperation agreement with Australia, with 9 ASEAN nations, with Japan, with Korea, which clearly means that defense diplomacy has become an element in our larger scheme of things, how to approach this region. Indo-Pacific construct. Now, increasingly, our documents have subscribed to that Indo-Pacific construct, which Australia has been really toiling very hard for the last 5 years, since Hillary Clinton made a statement with regard to Indo-Pacific as the future of the regional architecture. Regional security architecture, we have ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, ASEAN Regional Forum, and East Asia Summit, each overlapping with one another. But if you look into most of the communiques, they all talk about non-traditional security, education, knowledge, cooperation. But on traditional security issues, most of these frameworks really fail. So when we talk about India's larger Asia-Pacific policy, what exactly are the challenges India looks into? First is the regional security, because China is getting much more assertive in protecting its domain and developing certain secure zones where it feels that it can really manipulate and maneuver. The two issues which have been of importance for India and has reflected in its strategic policy documents are South China Sea and also Malacca Straits. The third issue, which is of importance from both strategic and foreign policy, is Islamic radicalism and Islamic State's influence in many of the countries in Southeast Asia. And then there is issues like fragile democracies in Myanmar when the military rule will come back once Aung San Suu Kyi goes out of the picture. Furthermore, when we have seen most of the Chinese diaspora control economy in Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore, and this is how we look into whether Indian diaspora will become much more strong in protecting and sufficing our interest in these things. Other element is Russia and China axis. They have conducted exercises in the past, and if this Russia-China axis evolves and takes India as a one country which is much more in pally with US, Australia and Japan, then we have a problem at hand. ASEAN fissures are coming to the surface. Why? Because Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar feel that the benefits of free trade, security, all these aspects has been taken over by Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and we are left with not much to really take home on the plate. India's lack of initiative on economic and trade issues is what has been really annoying many of the countries in Asia Pacific, including Australia and ASEAN nations. Connectivity, 2003 to 2017, we have been working on Asian Highway project. We have CASA 1000, which integrates larger Central Asia and South Asia, and also we have a lot of initiatives which have been taken to develop infrastructure and develop it in a bigger way. Now India is looking into two more architectures in terms of connectivity which are going to come up. One is digital connectivity with the larger Asia Pacific region, and second is with regard to evolving into knowledge grid, which means all these universities, all these economic institutions can be integrated into one knowledge grid so that people can know which university is doing research work or some good academic work in a specified field, so that there is no overlapping of research work which is done in multiple universities. Multilateral institutions and proactive diplomacy is what has changed over a period of time for India. When we look into the larger how India is really approaching, in fact I talk about defense diplomacy has evolved as a bigger tool. What exactly is defense diplomacy? Is it purchasing goods, equipment and military weapons from your friendly countries? Yes and no, both. Why? Defense diplomacy technically means allowing the space for the defense missions officers to interact with each other on a level playing field. But if defense equipment is taken at a friendly prices, let me highlight this, at friendly prices, then all these sale and purchase also come under the ambit of defense diplomacy. Like at one point of time, we were purchasing Russian equipment by giving back bananas to them. And ruble and rupee conversion was very much easier at that point of time. Then also opportunities for overseas students to attend courses at military training establishment. So at times our officers also attend Australian higher defense management courses, and Australian officers also come over here. Singapore, yeah.
No, continue what you were saying. But just on the first point there, how do you prevent like countries like China and Russia making you dependent on their sourcing of defense training and resources, and then it all kind of hits the fan and you're no longer friends with them? You still have that dependence on arms and training and stuff like that. How do you prevent that kind of tightly being just with Russia or just with China, and then it all hits the fan and the US wants to kind of go to war?
Okay, good. Good question, and thank you. I'll tell you the basic trajectory also. It's something like that when USSR was disintegrating. In fact, most of the defense establishment, production establishment in USSR were spread all across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and many other CIS countries. So when we wanted certain spares, Russia has increased the prices because their ruble was really getting down and they wanted certain funds. So what India did, at times we thought that anchoring on one supplier is dangerous for the defense of a country. And so what we did, we got few of the equipment from Ukraine. And furthermore, at that point of time, there was a debate within the national security establishment of India that why shouldn't we really buy these Russian scientists? Because they were unemployed. But given the fact that India is slow to react to it, because Russia was a well-known friend and you could not really annoy Russia now, which was the successor to USSR. So what happened that Israel took the initiative. It brought many of the Russian scientists to their establishments, and at times we got Russian equipment manufactured in Israel to India. So creating artificial structures or supply chains. France, which was closing down the Mirage 2000 production chain, despite the fact that we were using it, we gave the orders to them to at least supply that Mirage 2000 space to them, and also giving them further incentive to upgrade few of the Mirage 2000 aircraft that we were really working on. So that's why now I tell you this, there is a financial capability for India to really support that sort of institutions. And furthermore, what has really happened? That Russian lesson has made us aware that we can't put all our eggs in Russian basket. So we have now purchasing things from Poland, Israel, Italy, Germany, Britain, you name it. Our whole defense basket has become as more diversified as ever. Last year, 2015, we purchased $3 billion of American equipment through government to government sales, because our process with regard to tendering and from the vendor takes long. So we said we do it by government to government sales. So that's how we have acclimatized ourselves to the vagaries of it. With regard to China, we don't purchase any equipment from them, because they have been copying the Russian equipment threadbare, and surprisingly, Chinese are very smart people, let me tell you. Those equipment that they have copied from Russia and have developed, they got the best pilots of Pakistan to try them out. They don't allow their pilots to test those military equipment. And that's how J-10, J-17, all these equipment have been really developing, and Pakistani pilots have been flying them. But few of the times, we have come across information that the metallurgy is not as good. At a certain level, when an aircraft flies, the G-force is so strong that if the metallurgy is not good, the wings will break open. And two of the incidents have happened with the Chinese aircraft. And there was a mini sort of a revolt within the Pakistani establishment when they lost two of their pilots because of this metallurgical fault. So that's how really it works. Now also, we have also opened certain courses, higher command courses, which means anybody level of colonel or senior colonel can attend it, so that we can develop that camaraderie between colonels, so that you come across to Australian guy, he said, hi, how are you? We met in that higher command course. So that kind of higher establishment gets much more aware of the possibilities and the opportunities that exist between two. Provisions of loan service personnel, short-term training teams, and civilian and military advisors to overseas governments for extended periods. In fact, we are now deputing our personnel in certain establishments, including such as Singapore. Two of our naval personnel, not the defense attaches, are deployed over there, as well as one Coast Guard personnel also in Singapore, to look into which ships are crossing, which ships are carrying, and that is that. If you look across many of the agreements that we have signed in the defense domain, which is technically defense domain, is white shipping information. What is white shipping? White shipping technically means your merchant ships. But if you have all the information about white ships, then you basically know which are the gray ships left. It's something exclusion principle. So that's how we are really working. And if you look into the last 2 years, our foreign policy documents, there are 4 and 5 major terms which will be used. One is technology, second is infrastructure, third is terrorism, fourth is cultural connection, and fifth is employment and skill generation. You take out any document, be it the joint statement between India and Israel, India or Germany, India or France, India or Britain, these 5 terms you find it threadbare in most of the documents, which clearly shows what exactly are the India's priorities in the forthcoming years. Then we have visits by ship, aircraft, and other military units. You will say it's very natural, any country really visiting ships and aircraft. But we hosted a number of ships from US, Australia also. We have a joint exercises in 2015. Then second edition could not really take place, but now the third edition is taking shape. So this is how we really interact and create certain bonhomie between different military units, forces. Inward and outward visits by ministers and by military and civilian personnel at all levels. Staff talks, conferences and seminars to improve mutual understanding, and exchanges of civilian and military personnel and joint exercises. This is how whole defense diplomacy objective of India is being served. And interestingly, in India, within the Ministry of Defense Affairs, there is a division which deals with Joint International Cooperation, JIC, which is manned by a person to the level of Director General, which is Joint Secretary. So what is India's approach or the possible trajectory in future? What is India really thinking about with regard to engaging with the larger Asia Pacific region? Engage ASEAN for services. When we talk about most of the negotiations that India is taking in trade and economic domain, it wants to really engage many of the countries in services because we are very strong in services. If you open our Indian economic survey, more than 60% of our GDP is contributed by services. Manufacturing comes much lesser, and the primary agriculture comes far on the downgrade. The other aspect is study the structures. India is really endeavoring on studying the structure, which includes Trans-Pacific Partnership, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Out of these three, RCEP is the only one in which India is in the negotiating table. Otherwise, TPP and APEC, we are out of the scene. But then, if you want to prepare for the future, these two institutions is what India is really looking forward for. However, in terms of compliance and also adhering to the norms, be it in the case of competition, labor rights, TPP and APEC are the two gradients for India. Now India's policy has become much more nuanced in terms of short-term interest, medium-term interest and long-term interest. So I won't be surprised when the Act East policy will include the whole of Japan, Australia, Pacific Islands, reaching it to the west coast of Americas and Latin America. Build the triad, which means Fiji, PNG and Timor-Leste will be the areas where Indian policy will be focusing into, apart from Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific for sure. Reinvigorate BIMSTEC as an example for SAARC. BIMSTEC evolved because it excluded Pakistan because of the priorities of the Indian establishment. But BIMSTEC has the maximum leverage in terms of low labor cost, cheap land, and also young population which can support any manufacturing hub which can be a big challenge for China for that matter in the coming years. And that is the reason why China also is interested in this whole region and is proposing BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Corridor Economic Development, as an antidote to it. Yeah.
With those smaller islands, have you perceived the threat of, I don't know how you view, it's quite a controversial issue, like global warming and the rising of the sea levels, and how that will affect like manufacturing of like Timor-Leste having a big issue there. Will that, if the rising sea levels, will that affect that?
With regard to small islands, we have an objective assessment that small island cannot sustain big production. But then if you see into the last 1 year, we have been professing the concept of blue economy, ocean economy in a big way. Why? It means sustainable exploitation of resources which can help the local population as well as give an economic fillip to these island economies. And you see in most of these cases, we are trying to develop that environmentally sustainable products, coir products, made from coconut fiber. It's very sustainable, it's very good, environmentally clean. Then tidal waves, generating energy from tidal waves, exploring minerals, modules, manganese, cobalt, nodules which are in the deep sea bed, exploit them so that these economies can find something to sustain themselves in the longer period of time. Furthermore, most of these island economies have the largest exclusive economic zone. Exclusive economic zone is the zone from the coastline to the 200 nautical miles in which the country concerned can exploit resources. Not only that, given the fact that India has now developed a very good scientific acumen, it has a it has generated that kind of technology and research in which it can explore minerals and tell the country that look, these kind of minerals are existing in you. The biggest fight which will be held with regard to dominating is with regard to rare metals. Rare metals which are used in your phones, space, aircraft, any kind of thing. China has a monopoly over these rare metals. And therefore, most of these countries will try to get as much rare metals into explore it, which is in plenty in the ocean seabed. It's not available on surface in any of the lands. So this is the one area where many of the countries will be looking into. In fact, we developed this maritime security triad, which includes Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India. Mauritius and Seychelles came and asked us that we want to join as observers. Why? Because Mauritius and Seychelles has extra large exclusive economic zone which has been mandated by the UN Seabed Authority, International Seabed Authority, which means not only 200 nautical miles, but they have an extra space, extra large zone which is under their domain. And I won't be surprised if island economies like Kiribati, Vanuatu will also jump the bandwagon and say, we want a larger exclusive economic zone. And then they will seek Australia and New Zealand help to exploring that resources. So there is a new domain, new horizon which is likely to emerge, which categorically talks about ocean-based economic development, generating resources, generating employment in a sustainable way, so that for the next 30, 40, 50 years, their population can thrive on that. This is the new frontier which we are looking forward for. And that's why India always professes composite development. Development through education, capacity building, health, knowledge, so that the countries can develop in terms of generating a services sector. I won't say there will be a big manufacturing in, let's say, in Tonga, but there can be a good hub of BPO, business process outsourcing, in which their talented, educated people could sit down in such a big room and can take calls from US, India, or any other Asian nations, generating revenue as well as income. Now, most of these island economies have income generated through remittances. Those who work in Australia, New Zealand, Gulf, or many other countries, if they can generate that kind of employment within their own territory, much problems with regard to environmental migration will be solved, at least for the next 22 decades or 3 decades. That is for sure. Then we have another narrative which is emerging, whether China wants to change the global power architecture through maritime Silk Road. What exactly is the maritime Silk Road? It's a dream. It's an idea in which Chinese manufacturing will integrate with most of these production units all across Asia and Africa. So what it happens when you know that you are going to lose your manufacturing power? What do? You search for the least developed economies, give labor that employment which can plug into your economy, which means in the end it will be made in China, but it can sustain that price which it was going to lose otherwise. If my running costs are 30 rupees, I produce this water bottle for 30 rupees. But my employed personal labor says that this is too less a wage because the inflation is very high in China. So what I will do? I will say, okay, let this cap be manufactured in Cambodia. This bottle be manufactured in parts of Africa. The water might come from India, but I will package it over here because I am creating that infrastructure all across, and I will put made in China stamp. So even if that bottle cap I pay 10 cents to Cambodia, this larger bottle Africa I pay 10 cents, the water I get it from India I pay 10 cents, but this will be a bottle priced $1. So who takes 70 cents out of this thing which is produced elsewhere? It's China. That's how it is really looking to sustain that dream. Why? Because if maritime Silk Route or all this One Belt, One Road does not sustain, it will have a huge implication for its own political and economic stability. Because people will say, we are not getting employed, we are not getting jobs. Give us a change. We want a political change because the political establishment is not giving to address our concerns with regard to life, sustainability, and employments. So what do? You use all your disposable income to at least make political stability and economic security both at the same time, looking into future. That way, this whole concept really works out. An infrastructure investment bank. So what do? You give a legitimate shroud to your endeavors and you create Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in which infrastructure, aid, assistance and all programs will be dictated by you because you are the biggest equity holder. You will decide, China will decide. India is also, but the percentage is 26%. In any voting pattern, if you have more than 60%, you decide who will get what. Then build on knowledge and capacity building. Training and education is what India has been looking into larger Asia Pacific. And India shows the resolve, but study the perception from larger Asia Pacific nations. Connectivity should not be only on the paper, and this is what is being professed by the current government, that no, if there is need for putting more financial assistance, get more. Integrate into regional value chain action plans 2016 and 2020. When this whole Indo-Pacific construct really came into being, the one thing was that what exactly are the institutional and mechanism which can support it? When you look into the whole trajectory, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation developed because Mahathir Mohamad tried to really project East Asia Economic Caucus. So Australia, sensing that there is a need to evolve into a larger Asia-Pacific framework, really gave fillip and impetus to Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. But Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, what has it done? It signified, it legitimized that concept of Asia-Pacific construct. There is a construct which means Asia and Pacific into one. What is Indo-Pacific doing? Indo-Pacific is bringing India and Indian Ocean into that scheme of things. But whether there are multilateral institutions which support this construct, there is hardly anything. So it needs to be seen how much multilateral institutional mechanism is going to support this kind of construct, which is known as Indo-Pacific. We need to have an institution which says Indo-Pacific Security Architecture or Indo-Pacific Security Association or Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation Association. So what we are doing, we are pooling in Indian Ocean Regional Association one way, East Asia Summit into one way, so that we create a vague sort of a structure which is as similar as Indo-Pacific multilateral institutional mechanism which might develop in near future. So we have these kind of institutions which are fighting with each other. ASEAN Economic Community, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and then we have Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is taking shape. Most of these economic constructs are overlapping into one another because the membership is nearly similar, but not completely identical. So this is how all these things are taking shape. FTAP, Free Trade Agreement of Asia Pacific, proposed by China and is still in the feasibility study phase. TPP, United States has gone out, let me tell you, but I have my hunch that United States will come back again. It can't leave it. And furthermore, somebody asked me, look, United States has really gone out of TPP, so it's a dead horse. I said, give it a time. United States was never there when it was really envisioned, conceptualized, because these were 4 nations which have conceptualized TPP. So US only went in a subsequent phase. Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is what encapsulates maximum number of nations over here. India, China, Australia, all, but it excludes US. It doesn't have a US, neither is the Russia. So these all types of constructs, economic constructs are taking shape, but it needs to be seen whether economic and security will clash in future or no. Let's say India and China are not in very good terms. Whether there will be economic overrider on these aspects or the economic process and takeaways go as it is. It needs to be seen in that context. So what exactly is the options for India when we look into the larger Asia Pacific? Water security, a big issue. Chinese building dams, not only on our rivers, but also in rivers in Southeast Asia. Mekong, a big river. China has built 13 dams and most of the rice fields require a lot of water. But if the river bed gets dried, the ocean water gets in. And when ocean water, salty water gets into agricultural land, you can't produce anything. So that is the area where India and many other Southeast Asian countries are going to sit down and talk to China about not to dam the river and the water, because otherwise it will have a harrowing effect on the life and livelihoods of all those people who sustain on rice and fish, the only source of protein for many of the communities living in the catchment areas of the river. We don't have a very big, rich people really living over there. China has its weaknesses, engage its periphery. And you see that in the case of India has embarked with engaging Central Asia, Mongolia, Taiwan. Taiwan is still, but in the last 3 documents that we have really agreed with China, we have never endorsed the principle of one China policy or even made a narrative with regard to Tibet. So it's very fashionable to talk about statements, but India doesn't make a statement but still have its leeway. So this is how India really works on. Indo-Pacific. Again, I raise the question, where are the support institutions and what are the cost of engagement? India loses near about 5,000 personnel in different activities, both counter-terrorism and also countering the attacks from across the border. So if in case we engage with alignment with, let's say, US, and we have to deploy resources in Iraq or for that matter Syria, whether Indian society is able to take that cost of life, not in terms of money, cost of lives into the largest society psychology of the society. It's not possible. Why should India fight a war in Syria? That's the biggest question which is debated in the international parlance. And India is also looking to ASEAN defense industry platform fabrication. We have a whole lot of ships to be ordered. We want to be a 500 ship navy by the year 2030. So what do we have to do? We have to produce new ships and also look for replacement of the existing ships. So what do we do? All the coast yards are full to the potential. We can't take. So what do we intend to use? Develop that ASEAN defense industry or other countries which have enough potential or enough spare shipyards which can develop these ships for us. Not that strategic, configuration electronics, but the basic platform which we can easily get it from there and use it our own self. So India will be creating that employment in the defense sector in the near future, which means platform integration. Northeast India, Myanmar and Thailand, we are looking for transaction of low-tech manufacturing because this whole zone needs development so that India, all these countries can integrate one into another. Military training and exercise, deploy personnel to train. The two countries which have really developed a niche or an adaptation to India's training facilities are Myanmar and Vietnam. They are really sending their people over to India to train because they want their professionals to be purely professional, not the politically motivated army men really decorating themselves. Build diaspora linkages. In the next 5 or 6 years, diaspora is going to be a major bulwark for India to really expanding its linkages all across. Build strategic anchorages. Australia, Japan, US and Vietnam will be the areas where India will be really looking forward for having much more comprehensive dialogue. And this is manifested because we have 2+2 mechanism, which means defense ministers of many of these countries along with India and foreign minister of India sitting down together and discussing those strategic and foreign policy objectives which are mutually beneficial and complementary to each other. So where has India is forwardly looking into in terms of engaging the Asia Pacific? East Asia Summit, build consensus. It's still an informal mechanism and it needs much more strengthening, but the major cause and which is a deterrent also is ASEAN centrality, which is being debated all across the region. Whether ASEAN is really important for building this consensus or not. But every now and then most of the countries in the East Asia Summit say that ASEAN centrality is of paramount importance. HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. The unfortunate incidents of the Malaysian Airlines getting out of air, I don't know where it has really gone. But it has shown the limits of even the superpowers like China to search and rescue. And this is where most of these countries will try to hold hands to each other with regard to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And given the fact that in multiple cyclones and tornadoes are really affecting the Asian region, I think this is the one area where India will be trying to get the best practices and also build capabilities in regarding this. The other aspect where a large number of cooperation will be really resting on is regional terrorism database. I am a person, I hold a passport. In the passport, my religion is never mentioned. I change my religion. From a Christian, I become a Muslim. I will use the same passport, but nobody will come to know what is my objectives are. And that is becoming a bigger problem in the coming years to come. That's how nations will have to share intelligence on religious converts. I might be some person, but the next day I might be somebody else working for IS or some other institution. Space is another area where most of these Asia Pacific nations will cooperate, including India, given the fact that it has a very excellent track record by sending the cheapest Mars mission in the world, and work on nano and micro satellites, which includes involving IITs and other technical institutions across the region. Study de-radicalization programs, and Indonesia for us will be a good example. In fact, in this regard, I believe most of these countries which are facing terrorism will have to develop a bridge between radicalized youth and their de-radicalization programs. Conflict resolution, Aceh and Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Both of these have been resolved now, but we still look how these other conflict zones are really going to emerge. We are still working on formulating a policy document on Act East policy, because the more critique came to Indian government establishment was, where is the basic finance document with regard to Look East policy? It's hardly there. India will work on rebuilding of institutions such as BIMSTEC, Mekong Ganga Cooperation, and institutions like Mekong India Economic Corridor, which is likely to take shape in near future. This nowadays, there is more talk about Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor, which encapsulate most of these economic institutions which are in the Asian region. Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific need to make choices. India will have to work hard to really look into which is the better metaphor or other construct which is it can use in its strategic and foreign policy choices. So when we look into India's role in the Asia Pacific, how we can really sum it into? First, it's a balance of interest, which means multi-alignment. On climate change, environment, food security, we are on the side of China. On issue of security, terrorism, and other aspect, we are siding with US. On the issue of regional security, we have partners Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and US. So this is balance of interest, not the balance of power. Encroachment of strategic spaces. Now what you have seen in the last 2-3 years, every country wants to play the brinkmanship. US traversing through South China Sea, India traversing through those islands, undertaking certain exploration projects with Vietnam, defense cooperation with Philippines, its ship making every now and then port calls, Japan supporting them with ships, Coast Guard, patrols, technology. So what is it? It's encroachment of strategic spaces. China coming into Indian Ocean, a big issue for India. India getting into South China Sea, a big issue for China. East China Sea, a big issue between Japan and China. Everybody playing brinkmanship. Chinese fighter jets cross over into East China Sea and Japanese jets are scrambled. So what is it? Everybody wants to see how deep is this gorge, but nobody wants to jump. So this is typical brinkmanship. Aid and assistance as a tool. People say that most of the aid and assistance has a social leverage, but now aid and assistance are a typical strategic and foreign policy privilege. You want to give aid and assistance to those countries which subscribe to your concept, your thought. And that is how aid and assistance has become a tool, both strategic and foreign policy too. New constructs to safeguard nation's interest. Then again, the thing comes, what is it, Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific? Which serves that? Is it South Asia or Southern Asia? Is it Pacific Islands or larger Pacific Sea, Pacific Ocean? What are we really looking into? Multi-alignment and non-commitment. Every nation wants multi-alignment and non-commitment to any other objectives of the other nation. So what is it? It's a complete complex matrix in which choices, preferences and interests are juxtaposed one with another. So you have an economic interest at one point of time dominating your foreign and strategic discourse, while on the other hand, it's the security which dominates your foreign and strategic discourse. Search for common minimum denominator. Every nation is now looking into common minimum denominator in which all the nations in the world can sit down together and discuss, at least we can agree on this. Multilateral institutions becoming extra-regional affairs. So what do you have? Observers, not from that region, but outside. Dialogue partners, not from that region, but outside. So that creates an multilateral institutions becoming extra-regional affairs. Then India has embarked on a larger horizon which does include Pacific, and that is the result why we have a Forum for Indo-Pacific Island Cooperation, in which we look into whether this can be done with a number of islands. Furthermore, Latin America will be the new destination for India, because we are going to take from the track 2 level to track 1 level of our interaction with Latin America and Caribbean nations. So India is growing, India is calibrating, but is it a reluctant power or not? For us, the domain, the horizon is Asia Pacific, and we look forward for more cooperation with those like-minded countries which have identical moral, ethical and democratic value systems. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So you mentioned that in terms of the conclusion that there is a need to search for a common minimum denominator. In your view, what is it?
Mm-hmm. You know, there are two basic elements in Asia which will be the minimum common denominator in which most of the countries will agree into. First is education, knowledge and skills. Every nation which is underdeveloped or developing will look for education, knowledge and skill development, because that is what is going to give employment, and this employment generation will decide political futures of many of the leaders, because the current youth is as aware as anybody else. Climate change and other aspects come into the second rung of it, because those large countries which are not influenced, affected by this climate change won't discuss it. An island nation doesn't have that clout to really impress on many of these major nations. So climate change and other aspects will become a fringe element, but then they will address it as they have addressed in the Paris climate change, Paris climate agreement, in which they want to keep it below the 2-degree level, all the global warming should be. I believe that is it. Natural, non-traditional security and other aspects, pandemics, swine flu, bird flu, Middle East, these are where most of these countries will be really pooling their resources. But then there is a problem to it. If, let's say, there is a swine flu in India, and most of the products which it wants to export, particularly poultry or other, will immediately get a really curb. It will get decreased very substantially. And that being the economic aspect of it, many of the countries would not like to really declare that they are heavily affected by bird flu or swine flu. And this has happened in the past also. But also there is an economic element to it, that most of the countries won't like to share the swine flu strand with the medicine pharmaceutical companies, because they will be making money. And so the cheap cost generic drugs and medicines is what will make all these Asian nations come together. Howsoever bad the US or many other copyright companies will be talking about with regard to intellectual property. But that's how things will be gravitating in the future in the larger Asia and Pacific.
You said that India might be looking towards countries that have similar values. see India implementing any sort of socialist standards, such as basic healthcare needs across all of India or in certain areas? And if so, do you look to any particular countries that share those values?
When we talk about democratic fundamentals, Asian countries have different fundamentals with regard to democracy. They have a semi-democracy, they have a partial democracy, all kinds of things are there. In terms of human rights and other issues, in India, whenever that aid was coming from European nations, it was very meager to sustain any development programs in the long run. So if you want to sustain a long-term development aid assistance program, let's say in a particular specified community, and suddenly the aid really gets cut because of austerity measures, you can't sustain the development program. So what has India done? It doesn't want to really rest its dependence on all these meager aid programs. So it wants to develop that kind of thing. With regard to national health, there was a proposal in which India really professed national health program, in which any person can deposit a minimum sum for an year and gets the best medical facilities all the year round. In fact, that is applicable in Indonesia, and we are studying it, whether a person can get a national health card to undertake these kinds of things. On the aspects of developing medicines, health, and social security schemes and all those things, we are going out to all the countries across so as to understand their best practices. And this includes not only health, urban development, capacity building, sewage treatment, waste management, all these things. And these are critical because India is growing exponentially, both in terms of urban infrastructure as well as the population. A huge migration from rural spaces to urban spaces. And there we would like to take notes from countries which have successfully developed this whole thing. Australia might be one, Japan might be one, where in terms of e-governance and undertaking measures to cut down corruption, we have completely e-governance. A person can really log into his website and ask for his birth certificate, death certificate, registration of marriage. All these things are being slowly getting into. And the thing is that most of the India is now looking into 2 and 3 major domains. First, make in India, manufacture in India at low cost. Second, digital India, in which develop the capacities, not only in India but all across. Then startup India. Small enterprises should really start up, in which small amount of financial aid is being given. And then these countries can really develop it. Like on the issue of human rights, India does have its reservations. Why? Because of the fact that human rights can be used as a leverage whenever and whichever time you want to say it. You said one of these persons was really was being tortured, but in many of the societies, these kind of things really happen. You can't help it. But human rights used as this leverage to define your aid and assistance program is too much to really say. But yes, India is working because it has developed all those institutions which address these issues. We have National Human Rights Commission, we have National Minorities Commission, which address all these grievances at the local level. We don't want anybody to pass its judgment on these issues to India. So therefore, aid and assistance, we are not relying too much on it. It's because it should be unlocked aid and assistance program. And we are looking forward for all those countries which need aid and assistance in kind or in person or in skills so that we can help them out. I believe I have answered or I have missed something. Okay. Yeah.
I was going to say, you said that India's overtaken Pakistan economically. Will Pakistan always be economically relevant because of the tensions between you guys, or if so, what do you make of the China-Pakistan growing relations economically, and also the recent visit between Modi to Nawaz Sharif? What do you make of that?
The Pakistan thing is that Pakistan is too much anchored into anti-India stance. And that's why you have our constituency, which also works on the anti-Pakistan stance. So they feed on each other. It's a very good, unique marriage. Haters' marriage, If you look into our trade, which is the country which benefits most through our indirect trade is United Arab Emirates. More than 90% of our trade is facilitated by the United Arab Emirates. If we had something like Southeast Asia Free Trade Agreement in principle, and Pakistan giving us most favored nations status as such, then we might be doing a whole lot of trade, including our cotton. We would like to get few of their products across to India, and there is a huge potential. SAARC as an institution could not develop because we were politically polarized, but economically we didn't really explore that much. Sri Lanka India Free Trade Agreement, one of the most nourished, well disciplined and excellent free trade agreement, and that's why Sri Lanka now wants to do comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, which includes services also. Nepal, India, very wonderful trade. Bangladesh, India, we have trade, but then we are competitors in terms of sugar and jute in the international market. We are creating cartel, something like OPEC, so that these prices should not go down if there is a mass production, mass produce in both India and Bangladesh for that matter. So that's how it really gets up. SAARC could not really become an ASEAN as such because it doesn't have the economic propulsion to push it through. And as we have security reservations, concerns with regard to terrorism and definitions and all those things, I think it will take ages for both the countries to come to a saner ground and discuss it threadbare. At times, we are much more what is called dictated by the media, loud mongering across the TV channels. So their TV channels shouting on us and our TV channels shouting at them, because then it gives them TRP and a lot of revenue material from the advertisements. Yeah. Anything else? So I think it's enough for the day. Huh? How many classes you had? If you want to really look into India's perspective, there are two basic documents. We don't come out with defense white papers, but there is Ministry of Defense annual report, which is available in the Ministry of Defense websites. Do go through our maritime security strategy, the last 3 documents, which clearly professes what exactly is our maritime objectives in the larger scheme of things. And then there is annual Ministry of External Affairs report. Don't read the whole document. Read the first 25 pages and you will know how we are really looking forward in the next coming years or so. That's how we really work. Thank you guys. Have a safe trip in India. Enjoy it. I believe it's a palatable cold over here when the bats are dying in Australia. Thank you very much.